Hi, Charlotte. How are you doing? You okay? Hello.
Hello, you okay?
How are you doing? I'm good, thank you. And you?
Yes, good, thank you.
Good stuff. So we'll start off with the resource management today.
I just check. I'm trying to get on my
Go on.
the sound of my phone, so I'm trying to get onto my laptop, but I can't see what the code is.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if Aman sent a revised code, but that's where I think what you'll have to do is I can email this to you, but the other bit would be to, if you have WhatsApp on your laptop, then you can basically open it there and then click on that, and that should allow you to get onto the webinar. Give me one second, I'll quickly email.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can do that.
Resource. There you go. Okay. This is a bit of a, let's put it this way, a bit of a broad unit.
Okay.
Resource management, is a word which is, I don't know whether you're aware, but resource management is generally, in today's context, related to human resources, resource management of resources. But the way this has been structured with ATHE is obviously it will cover both physical, administrative, financial, and human resources in general. So this is more of a generic use of the word resource management. And that is where we are going to be looking at, focusing on some of the key terminology. And obviously, I will try and filter it down to the fact that we know exactly where and what we are looking at covering from a point of view of, the indicative content specifically for the unit.
Okay.
So one second, let me just quickly share my screen now. What I want to do is weed out some of the slides which I don't think are going to be relevant for us, but just for the sake of having them, I think the idea would be to try and put them across here, so it gives you a bit of a wider perspective.
Okay.
So let's start off. So what I'm going to do is I'm kind of filling in for Anjum today, because I'm going to be doing the unit customer resources relationship management with you tomorrow. He's dropping his brother. He was going back to Canada, so it would be impossible for him to travel to from Bradford to Manchester and then go back and do the session.
Yeah.
So he told me on time, and then obviously what I will do is take this forward for him today. So let me just save this so I can email a copy of this later to you. So one new two. Okay, let me just share the screen. Whereabouts are we? Great. I'll admit you.
I think
I'll admit you on the other side. I didn't know where the controls went.
There we go.
So many screens open. Yeah, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, that's great. Let me just minimize some of the others, because what I would do is some stages obviously also show the full screen, because we'll have to fluctuate between the unit spec and the introduction to the unit. So let me start off by showing you the unit spec, which is up on Moodle, and that is what we are looking at, essentially covering today. So in this particular unit, resource management, as I mentioned to you earlier, what you will basically see is that, great. So what we are going to do is obviously in this unit, resource management, this is a term generally used from my perspective, and in most modern organizations now, because the most valuable resource is human resource. Although we look at physical resources, administrative resources, infrastructural resources, financial resources, these are all classed as resources because they are required for any organization to function on a day-to-day basis. But going forward, I think it is quite well known and established fact now that human resources are the resource which are able to control all the other resources. So we can essentially, as humans, work on machines or use equipment. We can obviously use financial resources. Sometimes when we need to do our work, get things done, goals accomplished, achieve objectives, we use physical resources, or we do need physical resources. If you're in the minutes of the meeting and you're the minute taker in the room, you would need a notepad and a pencil or a pen to be able to take notes. And obviously that's a resource that you would need to be able to do your job. So in some cases, it's a very generic term. And when we look at the word resource in particular, it can be classed into various different forms, or at least types from a point of view of definition. And when we in general look at dictionary meaning of it, it basically refers to, the bit in terms of material. It could be building, staff, assets, money, and anything which the organization needs to work effectively or essentially do its day-to-day job or functions. Now, this unit, in the onset, we are going to be looking at 4 learning outcomes. We're going to be covering learning outcome 1 today. And the idea would be to try and start off with a bit of an introduction to related to the business environment, and then look at where do we see use of resources within that business environment. So if I move you over now to the presentation, there are a few bits that we will look at on a one-on-one basis, which is to say individual assessment criteria in learning outcome 1. So what we will do in the first one is to understand key features of resource management. What is resource management? Why is it used? How companies use it? What are the various, things within the word resource? Facilities, money, material, staff, physical buildings, things like that. We'll cover that. And then we'll look at both the assessment criteria 1.1 and 1.2, which basically looks at covering requirements of organizations from a different sector-oblique industry point of view. So things like primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector, quaternary sector, we'll discuss that. And then we'll also look at understanding why resource management has become important, because everything is finite. All the resources are finite. So whether it's financial resources, whether you look at environmental resources, when we look at coal, for example, or we look at oil and gas, for example, these resources are finite. So obviously, effectively, what the companies, organizations, businesses need to do is manage these resources in a way wherein we can get the utmost productivity and efficiency out of them. And obviously, the idea would be to try and understand how this is put into context and in use within the organization. And the distinction criteria in this talks about taking it further. So we know resources, but we understand the importance of resources. What we want to be able to do is now understand how organizations see this, how they can get affected from internal inside and from outside. So internal and external factors which can impact the utilization of these resources by the companies is what we will look at in the distinction criteria. Now, if we go into the presentation slides, what I've done essentially is there are some generic slides that I put, which I want to bring into for the purposes of discussion so that we have an understanding, or at least a bit of a foundation understanding in terms of what is the aims and objectives of studying this particular unit. So we are going to be looking at an overview of human and physical resources needed in a range of organizations. So when I say range of organizations, what we mean by that is we're looking at primary organizations, which are organizations which produce or extract raw material from the earth. We're looking at secondary organizations, and we are looking at tertiary organizations. So when we talk about sectors, we'd be looking at primary sector, secondary sector. Primary sector would include sectors like farming. So that is where it says range of organizations, including those in primary, service, and manufacturing sectors. So primary sectors include farming, mining, fishing, hunting, things like that, which is basically to do with natural resources. And then we will look at secondary sector, which is primarily, manufacturing, essentially, things like when we look at car factory, we look at, for example, United Utilities in the Northwest supplying water, a range of, I would say, engineering organizations which are producing goods which are being, let's say, processed from the natural resources into some sort of finished goods. And then we will look at tertiary sector, the services side, which is primarily where we buy some of these things. So you go to Tesco, we go to Waitrose, we go to John Lewis, and that is where we are buying some of these items, is what we are going to be looking at, from a point of view of sectors. So you have primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. And obviously we have quaternary sector as well, which is where consultancies, services, research organizations work. And they basically look at drawing out reports, or formats of different types of reports, essentially to provide advanced services beyond what the three basic sectors can provide: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Okay. Now, in addition to this, what we're also going to be looking at is, as I mentioned earlier, resource, because resources are finite. So what we want to be able to do is, if you work within an organization, say in a marketing department or within a sales department or administration, whichever department you want to fancy. So there are always finite resources in terms of budgets, in terms of people, in terms of physical resources available. So if you're a two-man team or you run a department and you're a part of that department, there are three people in that department. They will have a bit of a departmental budget. They will have certain objectives which have been given. And the idea there would be, as a manager, as a supervisor, you'll always be grappling with the fact that you need to look at utmost efficiency and productivity with the resources which have been provided to help fulfill organizational objectives. So here the idea would be to try and develop, as we go along into the various learning outcomes, the idea would be to understand physical resources first, then understand the utmost utilization in terms of efficiency building for human resources, and last but not the least, look at what are the ways through which we can actually improve and increase employee performance, and some of the tools and techniques which are employed within organizations, things like balanced scorecard, performance management techniques, PMT as we call it, in order for the organization to achieve its objectives. And the idea there and thereabouts would be that as a learner, you would be able to develop a good understanding about resources, different types, and how do we manage these resources should you have the responsibility to be able to manage them, whether it's in the finance department where you're responsible for budgeting, whether it's in the engineering department where you're responsible for ensuring less number of defects which are produced in the goods. When we go to the services side, customer service would have certain targets to understand returns need to be minimized or customer satisfaction needs to be improved. And that is where the efficiency side of things would be looked at in terms of increasing, performance of employees or staff, termed under inverted quotes, resources. And that is the whole essence of, obviously looking at this unit. And the first learning outcome, we're going to be focused on understanding, as I mentioned, types of organizations. We're also going to be looking at different sectors. We're going to look at physically, at least from a point of view of, identifying different types of resources and requirements which are used by companies and organizations and businesses to produce goods and services. And then some part of it will be related to understanding importance. How do we reduce wastage? What are the steps which organizations put in place to make sure that they are utilizing the resources to their utmost capacity, reducing wastage, reducing material going to landfill, and in some cases also looking at understanding how can waste be recycled. So sometimes you look at companies like Veolia and you look at BIFA and some of these companies which are basically into sustainability and waste management, and how do they look at profiteering, how do they look at generating profits and profit from the utilization of waste which is produced by other companies, but for them that is the input or the raw material, and they look at using this effectively to recycle material back into the earth or the environment without them causing long-term harm. So in terms of key terminology, I think something which I would put across is, because it's a very broad term, this, in terms of, let's say, definition point of view, in general, would always be focused on understanding how best to utilize any form of resource within the organization to be able to help accomplish organizational goals and objectives. So it could be things like, when I talk about human resource, what are the things that are important for me from an organizational perspective is the skills that I bring to the table, the experience I have of previous working within organizations or similar situations, the academic knowledge that I have, and also the let's say the skills or soft skills that I bring in to the working environment, which allow the company to help in the achievement of goals. So in general, this is more about, when I say what is resource management, it's all about planning, scheduling, allocating, and ensuring the best utilization of resources available to the organization to be able to achieve goals and objectives. Sometimes you see, and I'll give you an example here, sometimes you would see that if there are things which are being done on a repetitive basis within the organization, you would see that the company looks at investing into technology. And this helps eradicate duplicate things or duplication of tasks, which is happening because of manual labor. So if you look at engineering firms, they end up employing machinery and equipment is primarily because it makes the resources, human resources are operating those machines and equipment more efficient. They are able to carry on more work. You look at a simple example of roadworks, which might happen in and around where you are or around your office and things like that. Sometimes they are trying to, lay pipelines or, later new telephone lines or broadband or whatever it is. Imagine if they had to dig that road, with manually through using shovel and plow, and assuming if they dig it through the use of an extractor or other bits, that is where you see technology coming into aid, wherein the equipment allows them, the workers working to dig that place quite quickly, and they are able to get through that piece of work, which is to be done, either repair or laying down new lines, whatever it is. And that would be efficient utilization of resource. So if a project is to come up and a company takes that contract to repair or repair potholes in a particular section of the road, and if they don't have equipment or the correct equipment to be able to utilize and do that job, they might be at it for a couple of days, as maybe a few hours, which would have been initially looked at from a point of view of efficiency and productivity. So it's all about effectively planning, scheduling, and allocating resources so that the organization is able to achieve its objective. That is what I would say resource management would be. And depending on what kind of sector the company is in or the business is in, they would utilize those, they would basically look at those resources which would be helping them complete those jobs or achieve those goals and objectives which are set by the management. Now, one of the other things that I want to look at, briefly explaining, though it is not directly related to resource management, is that we use this term sector in industry quite often. Have you come across this term? Okay, we are in a pharmaceutical sector, or I have a business which is in the education sector, or I have a business which is in the construction. So what is the difference in terms of usage when I say industry and when I say sector? So these terms are used interchangeably when we look at, kind of categorizing the operations of a company or a business according to the different types of, sectors they work in, or say, for example, different types of resources they use to be able to produce, goods and services. So when I say sector and when I say industry, it's, although they seem quite similar in terms of broad definition, but the term sector and industry are not interchangeable, but they are used in the economic context when I say, that this is the sector in which the company operates, or this is the industry which the company serves. So a sector refers to a wide field that could be defined as a certain set of activities that take place within that field. And examples of sector would be primary, secondary, and tertiary and quaternary sector that is listed down here. And when I say that if I want to capture the specific type of activity being conducted by the company, business, or organization within that sector, then I would use a smaller term, which is called industry. So industry is generally a smaller term. It is generally defined as a grouping of activity or a group of activity which the companies carries out. And this would fall under various sectors. So sectors would be
larger.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. And sectors would be made up of a variety of industries. For example, if I say I have an industry in the secondary sector, which could be meaning that either I have a business in the building and construction trade, or I have a business within the car manufacturing, or some sort of factory, which basically could be, say, for example, producing bread, bakery at the end of the day. And that would be an industry. But the moment I say sector, I would be referring to secondary sector, because that is where the raw material which is being extracted by farming is used as the input, and the secondary sector actually works on this using equipment and machinery to be able to produce a loaf of bread. And that is where I would say that, okay, the business is in the bakery sector, or my business is in the secondary sector, and my industry is bakery. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
So when we would refer to, because these terms are used in the broader definition and are quite used interchangeably, although they are not, in the context of resource management, we have to be very clear that these terms we can differentiate. So when I say sector, what I mean by that is you are in a specific sector carrying out certain set of activities in that area. And they would be primary, secondary, or tertiary. So primary would be farming, or things like hunting, fishing, things like that. Not hunting really, to be honest, in the modern context, but looking at farming, mining, and fishery in particular. And when I talk about secondary, it will be manufacturing. And when I talk about tertiary, normally services. Mm-hmm. Is that clear?
Then what about that quaternary one? I've not heard of that.
Quaternary sector is anything which is not defined or not being referenced to primary, secondary, and tertiary, and wherein there is let's say advanced usage of services which are produced beyond these sectors would be termed as quaternary. So for example, as I mentioned, in quaternary sector, we'll have organizations which are into consulting. They don't really produce much data, but they utilize that data to be able to do filtered reports, or create reports on the basis of what a company would want. You would look at consultancy organizations, research organizations, or companies which use technology and put it to use for good, say, for example, for solving issues or problems. They would be termed as companies or industries which are in the quaternary sector. Quaternary sector is pretty much, I wouldn't say a recent addition, but they are basically, in the digital world nowadays. So when I talk about internet and the usages of internet that you can get, so companies like YouTube, if you have to define, and look at relating it to the internet. So when you look at the companies which provide you the internet, things like BT, TalkTalk, they are in the primary sector. When we look at companies like YouTube, they are in the secondary sector, because they are essentially users are producing the content and they're uploading to YouTube. When we talk about tertiary sector, it is companies like YouTube, you have Twite, you have Instagram, some of these, wherein these videos are posted and consumers can consume it. And when we talk about quaternary sector, the consumption of these videos by various members of the public, and when we talk about these being utilized for advertising promotion, would be termed as the quaternary usage or the quaternary sector, in terms of, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay? So generally speaking, if we have to talk about organizations within primary sector, you have farming, fishing, hunting, and mining primarily. When you talk about secondary sector, it's anything to do with manufacturing, engineering, and they would fall into secondary sector. So example, you have radiators in the house, you have wardrobes in the house. Where were they built? They were built in a factory. That factory would be an engineering factory, or a wardrobe, or whatever kind of a furniture factory or a warehouse, and that is where they have been produced, and that is there in the secondary sector. Would you buy from the warehouse? Would you buy from the factory directly? In most cases, no. So where would these materials get sold? They would get sold through the distribution outlets, retailers, the furniture home, and furniture land and all those stuff. And that is where they would be termed as in the tertiary sector, from which you buy the services. So similarly, Tesco is not producing everything, but Tesco at some stage are also producing. They have their own bakery, they have their own departments in terms of producing certain goods that they sell in the stores. But when you look at the Tesco store, it is a tertiary sector because they are selling goods from there. But if I go back slightly and look at Tesco dairies or Tesco bakeries, if they have, and that is where they're producing breads and milk from the farmers, then that will be termed as secondary. And obviously, wherever they are procuring that bit from directly from the source, which is farmers, would be termed as primary. Anything in the terms of quaternary would be when I buy from the distribution outlet. I might be a small trader. I might have a small, let's say, a news agent shop. I might go to Tesco's or Costco's and buy a lot of stuff and then sell it from my shop. That would be termed as quaternary because I'm buying from a retailer and then trading it further from my own outlet, and that would be classed as quaternary. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, a broad sense of when we look at resource management, when we relate this to company, what we are relating it is companies have vision, mission, they have objectives and strategies, and they apply different types of strategies to fulfill these objectives and goals at the end of the day. So when we talk about vision, what are the businesses into? So Tesco's vision, Tesco's mission is, say, for example, to serve customers, and obviously they are in the grocery market, clothing market, electronics market, blah, blah, blah. What are the objectives they want to accomplish? They obviously want the share of the market. They want to be the biggest retailer in all the segment. They want to quash the competition. They want to offer the lowest possible prices to consumers, get most footfalls. And then what are the strategies they employ? One of the things that you get as a tip from their tagline is every little helps. So obviously they're always trying to drive prices down. They're always looking for bargains so that the customers can get their bargains. And obviously that would mean they get more sales and revenue and hopefully profits at the end of the year. And what are the tactics they employ? Tactics here would mean they do a lot of advertising. They do lots of promotions. Sometimes you see promotions within the store, and it talks about, you buy during Christmas, for example, when we shop during the holiday season, we shop Black Friday sales. You buy 3 and you get the third item, buy 2, get the third one free. That is a tactic. That is a promotion. That is a advert. They do lots of different types of promotions. And the idea there is to try and maximize the sale of their goods and services. So every organization would essentially utilize resources in a way that they can achieve their vision, they can fulfill their objectives. They employ a lot of strategies, and in some cases, time-bound strategies or tactical maneuvers, which will allow them to achieve those goals. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we talk about resources, it can also be said that it is a transformation process. Why do we say that? When we talk about services, when we talk about different sectors and industries, what you're seeing is a dairy farmer would essentially take, or buy milk from farmers. But what in that process they would do is when the milk is procured and they come and obviously it's a factory or it's a business which has procured this, they are going to turn that raw material into different goods which are going to be sold to customers. So milk would be produced they will sell it milk as it is, but that milk can also be used to produce cream, different types of cheese and, other bits and pieces. And that is where you would see that when we buy raw material or when we buy material, for us, that could be raw material, which would be worked on, and that could be transformed into another finished good. So sometimes you would see a lot of cheese factories, they buy a lot of milk from farmers and other companies, and they work on it. So for them, the input is milk, but they process it using machinery, equipment, their own formulas and recipes, and they transform it into a bit of an output, which could be cheese that we buy from the store or from the shelves. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, resources can also be referred to as a process or as a transformation process, because not all resources would be resources for companies. Some of them would treat this as raw material or input, and some companies would treat that as, would work on that resource procured, would work on it, and then produce an output, which is then going to be sold to the tertiary sector or retailers, distributors, and that is from where the consumers will buy.
Okay.
So broader definition of, resources in terms of transformation process. Now, with this understanding, let's get into some of the assessment criteria and look at what do we mean by differing resource requirements of organizations in different sectors. Now, one of the first things which I want to just quickly run through, which I presume you have a good understanding of right now, because I think it's something that we've covered in one of the units. So when we talk about different types of businesses, right? How do we class different type of businesses? On the basis of ownership, right? So when we talk about public sector and private sector, within that we have different types of business organizations, or different types of organizations in general on the basis of ownership. So when we look at ownership, we can class businesses are set up as sole traders, partnership, limited companies, limited liability companies, charities, cooperatives, things like that. Are you aware of that? Yeah. So one of the reasons why we need to understand this is that when we talk about allocation of resources and the differing requirement of resources within different organizations, I think I'll bring the slide here. What we will need to do is relate it to the ownership of businesses, so that it can be put into a bit of context, that who are we talking resources for. So if it's a news agent might be, the owner might be the director of the organization, and he might be a sole trader. So when we look at a sole trader, essentially his requirement on, obviously business and business resource requirements would be different from a requirement if it's a limited company, if it's a large business, or a public PLC, public liability, or a large public limited corporation like Tesco's, or in your case, your own company as well. So resource requirement would be differing according to the size and type of the organization or business. So if I look at a news agent, just as an example, the news agent primarily would be, selling, say, for example, newspapers, some bits of grocery, some, over-the-counter products which are sold. They could be selling alcohol, cigarettes and things like that. But they are essentially a one-stop shop for a lot of customers local to their area, and they would be looking at visiting that shop to be able to service some of the requirements, which could be grocery products, house products, some of the other products that you would want to buy when you go to a local shop. Sometimes if the bigger shops are closed and things like that. So here, if I look at that as a requirement for a larger organization, they would have maybe a structure. So in a sole trader or in a small news agent shop, the person who's the owner might be only working, might not have employees. But the moment I relate this to a limited company, a small organization or a small medium enterprise, they could be tens of hundreds of employees. They would need they would need seating space. There would be infrastructure in terms of PCs, printers, all the other bits available for them to be able to work. And that is where you would see the resource requirements would start to differ. So from a point of view of ownership that we look at, we are going to be looking at focusing on what type of resources an organization would need, how much they would need, and what type of resources would be required to be able to fulfill those objectives. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So let's look at physical resources first. Now, all organizations need at some stage physical resources. And when we say physical resources, what do we mean by physical resources? Is that when we look at, physical resources, one of the things that you will look at straight away classifying them as would be that these are going to be tangible resources. That means things that I can touch and feel, and they would be classed as, physical resources. So they are going to be things like, if I just literally say an office, there would be things like the furniture, the PC, the printer, desk and chair, and they would be termed as physical resources as far as the organization is concerned. Okay. Yeah. Then we go across to, say, for example, talking about materials, or, physical resources will be differentiated from material, because this would be material that is required primarily to, do work. So for example, in the office, if you have a PC and you are required to do a job on the PC, and at the end of the day, you print it out, there are certain bits and pieces that you need as material. So what you need is paper. When you fire a print from the printer, you would need paper. You would also need, when I talk about material, it could be things like, electricity, which would obviously make sure that all the things are running. So when we talk about material, we are talking about physical things here, which would be required to, for example, make things work or meet the objectives. Another example that I would give here in terms of material would be if you understand, say, a business, which is a small business, like when we sometimes go to, auto parts, and you're wanting to get an MOT done, or, you wanted to, for example, get some repairs done on your car. Now, the tools which are going to be used by the person or the mechanic, or obviously the person who's looking after diagnosing that fault and obviously rectifying it, would be the physical material which the company or the organization would need to provide in order for the person to be able to provide those services to the customer. So if you go into, for example, a gas station or a petrol station essentially, and you want to look at checking the water level and obviously say air in your tires or tire pressure essentially, then in those cases certain pieces of equipment like the tire pressure gauge and the bits which are available would be material classed as physical material required to be able to use those services. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then we look at building and facilities. If it's a business and an organization and you have a number of people working within the organization, they would need a space to sit. They would need certain basic facilities like toilet facilities, kitchen facilities. You would have basic facilities which could be related to maybe having the broadband internet, lifts in that building, stairs or fire exit in that building, and they would be termed as physical facilities which are required to house the employee workforce or essentially employees working within the organization. And they would utilize one of the physical resources, which could be buildings and facilities. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, how would this be differing for different organizations in different sectors? So if I take the example of building and facilities, if you're an engineering organization, your setup required for the office space and for the factory itself would be different, because you would probably, if I look at the Heinz factory in Wigan, just as an example, if you look at that factory, it is spread across in a few acres. It's a very large factory which produces baked beans and 1 million cans of baked beans every week. If you look at the facility there, the facility wherein people are staffed in terms of office space is maybe quite small. But if you look at the gigantic space that they have wherein beans are being delivered and they are being processed and the canning is being done as a process within engineering, the storage of cans, the storage and distribution facility logistics, they are going to be enormous because of the fact that the factory is producing over 1 million cans of baked beans every week. So it needs to be shipped out, but it needs to be stored within the facility before it can be transported or shipped out to various shops, warehouses, distribution warehouses to be able to service customer demand. And their requirement would be far different than in terms of building and facilities with regards to an office space or a serviced office space wherein an accountancy firm is running and they have 7 or 8 partners running in that firm. They have small offices, but obviously their requirement is not an environment wherein they need a factory floor, they need lots of equipment. So again, here, the idea is to understand the differing requirements of the organizations depending on which sector they are working in. And this would dictate their resources, utilization, and requirements from a point of view of assessment criteria 1.1.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Any questions on this?
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's look at 1.2. Now 1.2 assessment criteria talks about importance of resource management and how this is achieved. Now, one of the things that we need to look at is, and I mentioned this earlier, is that all resources are finite. So when we talk about resources, whether it's financial resources, natural resources, human resources, or physical resources, if an office is expanding and the space is initially, they've taken or constructed the building or taken up the office space initially, wherein they could seat in 40 employees. But over a point in time, as the company's operations have expanded, they've accommodated 10, going to 20, going to 25, 30. But at a stage now they're at 40. Now, if they have to expand further and take on more people, the office space does not allow. So in those cases, what the company would start looking at some stage would be new office premises, either which could be premises where they could shift entirely the operation, or they could add on another site wherein they would take on more employees, and that would be a separate location. So when we understand, when we try and look at the importance of resources, we look at planning, and we look at some sort of, I would say, allocation that needs to be done to ensure that the business is viable, say in this case, for a couple of years. So sometimes what tends to happen is most owners, management, or the directors of the organization, when they look at planning for a couple of years, 3-year plan, 5-year plan, 7-year plan, they look at all the planning from a point of view of resources allocation, whether it's physical resources, infrastructure resources, financial resources, human resources, because the management at this side is looking at scaling up of the business increasing. And if it's looking at planning for increase in business, it is also required to look at scaling up of those resources, whether it's facilities, whether it's buildings, whether it's manpower, whether it's material, whether it's finances, all those have to be looked at. Now, from a management perspective, we look at this particular, kind of a diagram which I put forward, which basically says when we do resource planning and management, we follow a top-down responsibility approach, which basically means that you start with understanding what is the capacity required. Then you look at allocating that capacity across the resources that you have, and you do allocation of resources to see if all the people working within the organization have a PC, have a laptop, have a mobile phone, or some of the other bits which the company would feel necessary for them to be able to effectively work and help in the achievement of organizational goals. They would look at providing all those resources and allocate them to the employees. At some stage, when the allocation of resources have happened and people have started to use it, the HR department would step in and they would start to look at doing what is called resource management. If an employee ends up leaving, do they take the laptop home and the mobile phone home, or if they've been given a company car, or do they have to return it?
And return it.
That's correct. So sometimes large companies buy these cars on hire purchase or lease, and obviously if the employee ends up leaving, the office, property or things which have been provided for you to carry out your day-to-day responsibilities have to be returned back. There's a handing taking over, and that is where the process of resource management actually starts. So it's an example specific to HR. The HR would also then look at, once the resources have been allocated, you're being paid, you're receiving a salary, you're doing your bits. At the end of the year, what they would also look at is primarily understanding how well you're working within the setup, how well you're working within the organization. And when they look at how well you're working within the organization, what are the various bits that you are able to contribute when you work towards achieving some of these goals. And then last but not the least, they look at understanding what is your motivation to work. Are you committed to the organization? Are you loyal? And that is where the performance management side of things start to step in. So a top-down approach, which is required to understand the importance of resource management, can be seen in these 5 steps, which is capacity, allocation, management of it, and then obviously review and management of it in terms of performance management, which allows organizations to maximize efficiency and productivity of an employee. And that could be the same case, for a company which is in construction sector, or something in terms of a business which is primarily, dealing in engineering or manufacturing services. Another example that I would give you here, when we talk about these 5 phases, is primarily looking at understanding, if you imagine a company within a construction sector and they have a number of extractors which are available as inventory. Over the years, the company has bought these as assets and bought these equipments, and they are now an asset and on the balance sheet of the company. But when they get projects, there's an allocation of these resources which tends to happen along with the team in terms of human resources team. So imagine a big company like CBRE or any such construction company, wherein what will happen is that they land a project. So what will happen is there's a bit of project planning which will get in, and that project planning would require allocation of resources, which would mean number of people which are deployed in that project. What could be the physical resources which the company would look at allocating? Financial budgeting would be done, and at some stage, some sort of a review mechanism would be put in place that because we need to receive payments, or obviously it has to be paid for in terms of the project being completed by the organization. They have to pay salaries and look at expenses. At some stage, the team responsible, head office team, would be responsible, and they will put together some sort of a review mechanism in place, which will allow reviews to be done for performing employees, non-performing employees. And obviously, if somebody ends up leaving, is not performing, they would be asked to leave, or process of redundancy or firing would basically look at. And at the same time, the parallel process of recruiting would start in order to replace some of the members who have been asked to leave because of non-performance. So each of these steps is then explained in a bit more detail in some of the slides to say, what do we mean by resource allocation? Resource allocation is looking at, providing all the resources required to do that job. Now, if I am, say, for example, if you put yourself in the shoes of your manager and you are asked to, complete a certain set of tasks, what at some stage you would also do is, if for example, your manager was responsible for marketing and you're a part of the marketing department, and the management sets a target that this month we want to increase sales by 20. And for this, we will be looking at supporting the team with increased budgets for sale and advertising and promotions. So as a marketing manager within the department, what you will be tasked to do is produce a plan which will look at allocation of resources, which is i.e. budgeting, financial side of things, to say how many adverts can you, additional adverts can you do, or what is the additional promotional budget that you can get to be able to help the sales team achieve those targets. So in those cases, allocation of resources would happen, but before even the allocation would happen, you would do a bit of planning, and that planning would be looking at putting things into perspective in terms of what exactly can be done in order to achieve those targets, so whether they're achievable, not achievable, and what kind of resources would be required financially to be able to hit those targets. Then we look at resource leveling. We also look at resource forecasting and capacity planning. Now, when we look at one of the things which we talk about is resource leveling, is essentially a technique wherein we try and redeploy some of the underused or underutilized resources within the organization into a different project. So sometimes you would see, within companies and organizations, there are multiple projects running, and some of the projects are not yielding the expected output. Then what the management takes a decision is to redeploy some of the stuff, the budgets from there or physical resources from there towards another project, which they see is more, of importance in terms of bringing in revenue, or maybe, for the prestige and reputation of the organization. So in some cases, even team members are redeployed to ensure that, they are able to contribute to projects in which, company can achieve higher turnover or maybe sales revenue as against in the one that they are not producing any results. And then, like any organization, if it is looking at growth, if it is looking at increasing its sales turnover and obviously capturing a higher market share, they will always look at doing a bit of forecasting just to see that we would need this and this at some stage in the future. This would be increased budgeting. If there's a cost cost of living crisis, like we look at, there's rise in the fuel cost, there's rise in the costs which are impacting the economy in general. What would be the impact of rising fuel costs on, for example, logistics and transportation, or in some cases, the operations of the company? And that is where forecasting will come into place. And somebody as a project manager or as a person who's responsible will always be looking at doing this particular bit of checking and peeping into the future to see what could be the risks and potential risks that the company could face if the costs are to rise, or if manpower is to leave, or say, for example, if the project is to be changed, or project specification change and things like that. And then capacity planning. This is, if I use this term capacity planning, I would probably say from a point of view of example here, if I look at Nissan car factory in Sunderland. Now, during COVID, the factory, which basically runs 3 shifts, throughout the year, they decided that we'll close down the plant for 3 months. And when we reopen, we're going to run only 2 shifts. And the reason why the management took this decision was because there was enough inventory of finished cars available. And because of declining sales during the COVID pandemic period, it wasn't seen mandatory to be able to, do full-scale production. And that is where the company looked at reducing costs by reducing inventory, reducing their orders to their suppliers, and reducing the forecast in terms of allocation of resources by giving even the workforce paid off 3 months to ensure that it was able to save cost on the running operations of the factory, which is in terms of electricity, rental, and other costs. And that was that will be termed as what I would say as a resource and capacity planning process. Is that okay?
Okay, yeah.
Now, practical examples of this that we want to cover: how do we save money through energy and resource efficiency? How do we bring that across? One of the things that we are seeing is the cost of gas and electricity is rising because of the war in Ukraine or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we see that it has put a lot of pressure on, gas prices in terms of petrol prices on the pump, and everything is rising. So a lot of organizations like myself, in our organization and also elsewhere, we do these small things to be able to increase efficiency and obviously reduce cost. So things like moving to a paperless office, making sure all the PCs are off on the weekend, or maybe lights are switched off. You turn down the heating if it's warm enough. So those are basic bits where we see on a day-to-day basis how we are trying to save on resources and costs by utilizing less of the resources. So when we turn down heating, we are using less of heating as a resource. And in general, what is it helping us to do at the end of the month is reduce the bills that we pay or heating bills that we pay at the end of the month, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So these are bits in terms of, let's say, small initiatives which organizations do in order to increase, efficiency and reduce the wastage of resources within the organization. The other bit on the other side that you would also look at is a lot of companies now carry what is called the corporate social responsibility agenda, CSR. And obviously here the advantage, here the long-term goal and the advantage to the company is that they want to have a CSR agenda. And in that agenda, what they want to show is that they are careful and they are, let's say, I want to use the right word, they are careful and they are conscious of the fact that the resources they use are not going to be harming the environment. And in those cases, their aim, when I say is the company's, businesses, organizations' aim is to reduce the wastage of natural resources, which would mean that they would be available for longer use. And obviously that would mean that the company, if it utilizes them effectively, is also looking at reducing costs in terms of, environmental, one in terms of the use of resources for producing goods and services, and the second is also reducing the damage to the environment as far as that is concerned. So one of the things which companies are asked to do, especially the big retailers like Tesco's, Morrison's, Sainsbury, ASDA, is that they are consciously under pressure from the government and the retail consortiums and the various agencies to reduce the amount of waste which they are sending to landfills. Things like, things which become obsolete or say, for example, they become out of date, things like, milk, grocery products, fresh, dairy products. If they become obsolete in the sense that they go past the date, then obviously they can't be sold from the shelves. And this would mean that, this ends up going into a landfill. So the idea there is that these companies have been given targets to reduce the amount of waste they are producing, which is going to landfill. And this is being pushed under the corporate social responsibility agenda. And that is to say that you need to help preserve the environment. And in the long run, you're also helping to reduce costs, because this would mean that they are producing goods or, having the goods which are there on the shelves for longer, rather than having to replace them, retransport them, and obviously send them to the landfill. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, the distinction criteria that we look at is talking about internal and external factors which can impact resource management. Now, what we want to do is also have a bit of a perspective in terms of what is internal and what is external factor. So what is internal factor? Factors which the business can actually control. They are within the business or within the limit of the businesses. That means something inside the company. And when we look at external factors, we are talking about factors which are outside the business, which they cannot control. And these factors could affect other businesses, organizations, in the same way as it's affecting them. So if the inflation is going up, this is affecting all the businesses. This is not just affecting just one business, but it is affecting all the business. If the cost of fuel or petrol or diesel is going up, this is affecting all businesses, everybody within the economy, not just a particular business. So it's an external factor they can't, control. Internal factor would be if we have a number of employees leaving the organization, if there is low motivation or morale within the organization because the organization and the staff hasn't had any pay rise for the last 2 years or 3 years. So you see the rail union strike, which is happening. The reason of this strike is that they feel that they are not getting a pay rise as against some of the other public sectors which have got a pay rise in the last, post-COVID pandemic. So they haven't had a pay rise for 3 years. So what they are saying is this is something which the unions have discussed, and they've decided to look at balloting, and obviously a strike has been now called, and this is going to affect everybody externally. But the decision of going on strike and balloting, and obviously, the unions taking the decision was, I would say, an internal factor. And the factor which was responsible for helping them reach that decision is that they feel that the inflation is creeping up, the cost of living is going up, and the wages are not keeping, a track with it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
When we talk about external factors, we talk about PESTEL. And PESTEL in general would help us analyze what factors can affect businesses from a resource requirement and management point of view. Because if it's political factor, whether it's a economical factor, whether it's a legal factor, technological factor, environmental factor, what we want to be able to do is understand and classify the factor which is affecting the business from a point of view of relation to resource. And if we have to do the classification, we have to use this framework, and that will help us understand the external factor which can affect resource management in a business. Now, when we talk about internal factors, we talk about factors which could be budgeting that the organization is doing. It could be staffing level. It could be the level of productivity or the growth which the organization is undergoing. Some organizations saw their business shrink during the COVID pandemic because there was less demand. But when we look at Amazon and the likes of online businesses, their business, skyrocketed because people were locked in their homes. There were restrictions because of lockdowns, and most of the shopping, if at all they had to do, that was being done through the online stores. So it was the Amazons, the eBays, some of the other platforms which enjoyed the growth even during a downturn, and that was purely because of the circumstances which were put forward by the COVID pandemic, and this allowed customers to shop from home, and obviously it meant increased business for companies like Amazon. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So here in the distinction criteria, when it says evaluation, what you'll have to do is take up a particular organization and list what could be the factors which are external and internal, and then relate them to resource requirement for that company. So during COVID, for example, pandemic, if the Amazon saw increase in their sales, then the resource allocation in terms they were let me put it this way, from what I can recall, they were one of the few companies which were advertising vacancies. They were hiring new people. They were hiring delivery and logistics drivers. They were expanding in terms of a warehouse. And, they were one of the few companies which basically did, let's say resource management, resource planning, capacity building during the COVID pandemic, because they saw they basically could foresee the increase in sale happening because of lockdowns and people being only restricted to stay, for example, shopping from home or shopping online. So again, with the use of an example, what you'll have to do is basically classify in a table what are these factors, external and internal, and how they relate to resource in general, and how did the company, if you take up an example of Amazon, how did it look at planning? How did it look at forecasting? How did it look at? So basically, you have to just talk it through in order to do the impact analysis of how these factors help the business grow or help Amazon ship more parcels, or essentially, earn more revenue during a downturn, which most of the companies saw, but online companies did not get affected. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And this was a slide which I put together just as a perspective, visually, to see what is macro and micro environment, internal, external factors, pestle factors, how they come in, and what could be the internal factors or internal environment which could affect. Now, if Amazon failed to see the growth coming because of the COVID pandemic and customers buying online, and they did not scale up their production facilities, or they did not place orders with their suppliers to increase production, did not increase personnel, which would mean manpower, then they would have not been able to benefit from this growth that has happened during the COVID pandemic. So they controlled the internal factors quite well, planned on resources in advance, which allowed them to increase their business during the COVID pandemic, during the COVID pandemic, essentially. Is that okay?
Yeah, all good, yeah.
Good stuff. So that brings us to the end of the first learning outcome. And what I would do is basically a copy of this presentation, and the recording would go up on Moodle. The only bit that you'll have to look at is sometimes on the Zoom, we have constraints, in terms of how quickly the recordings are removed. So if you need to download it when you get that link, and then hopefully from there, you can revisit it.
Save it.
Yeah, save it and revisit it if you need to do that.
Okay, brilliant.
Good stuff. So thanks so much for joining this session today, and I will continue with you tomorrow.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.